But the first thing that we want to, go on from, and we kind of talked about in the last episode, is basically this perfect rep, right? Because we have, talked previously about a few different things, talking about how you can like learn anatomy. That's a good idea. How you should like learn exercise execution, that kind of stuff, exercise selection. And what ultimately comes down to is like, once you've done that kind of, baseline stuff, the first thing we need to really dive in on is a discussion of, I suppose, the perfect rep, but it all comes back to understanding what the goal of exercise is, which again, further back episode, right? But what's the goal of the exercises that we're doing right now? What's the goal of the workout program right now? And ultimately, for a lot of people, a lot of the discussion of resistance training, the goal of the exercise, it comes back to tension, right? It's at the heart of the discussion overall, right? And that doesn't mean that we are choosing exercises or we're choosing program design methods to always maximize tension, right? That's not always the case, right? Because we know, and we've previously discussed it, and we will discuss it in future when we're talking about progression models, ultimately the way you progress is that you progressively overload those muscles with tension. So it's progressive tension overload, right? And that's to do with resistance training, right? In terms of we want to build some more muscle. However, the goal of resistance training is not always to build more muscle, right? Oftentimes you might actually want to, just maintain what you've built. You might want to get other adaptations, such as purely like strength gains. Maybe we're touching more on the neurological, like the efficiency of the muscles, but also, and this is a lot of the time, and it's incredibly hard to discuss all of these nuances because there's so many different goals, but a lot of the time, like certain sporting athletes want to actually minimize tension, right? They actually want to minimize the amount of, well, I was going to say wear and tear. That's not necessarily the right word, but the amount of work that their body is doing in terms of their actual muscles having to work. They want to maximize stuff like, recoil. They want to maximize elastic energy. A lot of the time, say for example, powerlifting, like they want to get their muscles to do less work. They want to maximize leverages. They want to maximize all these other things. And that's always the goal. Like obviously if you fill out a weight class, and obviously at a certain stage, you're going to tap out that neurological efficiency and you're going to have to build more muscle. And it's not always the goal, but oftentimes you kind of want to do less work. You want to minimize tension, right? And so either way, at the heart of the discussion is this kind of thinking about tension on the muscles, right? Can you speak to that a little bit there, Gary?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that one way to conceptualize this in your head is to think back to the first time that you tried any particular skill-based sport. I think martial arts are a good example, but there's also many other examples. Swimming is another great example where for beginners, you end up wasting so much energy to complete the same task in comparison to someone who is proficient. So you watch a boxer, throw a jab or throw a combination of some sorts, and it just looks so smooth and it looks like they exerted barely any effort. And of course, they've learned that over a number of years. Whereas the beginner, they're just kind of putting all their muscle into it, all their energy. They're not efficient. They're not using their base appropriately. They don't know what they're doing. The same in any sort of grappling, whether it's wrestling or jiu-jitsu or whatever. You'll find that when you first start that, you're using all of your muscles to complete a certain movement. And that the more advanced guys, what they end up doing is using as little energy as possible for each movement, and then obviously keeping everything else in reserve. And that's fundamentally the goal of sport the vast majority of the time, is that you complete X task with the minimal energy required, because the assumption is obviously that you have to go and do that task over and over again, unless it's just a one bout sport.
But even just to interrupt, like you can kind of think of this as just like sport is to maximize efficiency, right? And you often see this, like if you see like, you watch the Olympics and you see like a gymnast and it looks graceful. It looks like every single movement was like perfectly timed, like that would be the ultimate expression of like maximal efficiency. And that's, again, most sports are looking for that. That's why we think of sport as being graceful oftentimes. It's because you're visually seeing that maximal efficiency, which is, it's real interesting because if you go into like, the science of attraction and different things like that, stuff that is like more symmetrical, like even people who, walk less symmetrically and as a result are, not minimizing efficiency but not getting maximal efficiency, like they are less attractive, and it's real weird that we have that built into us, but it is something to be aware of, that humans innately like this efficient aesthetic, if you will.
Yeah, and that's sport. That's the first thing to understand, is that that's sport, or any sort of task where you're focused on the external performance. So that doesn't mean you have to perform a sport. It could be that you're someone who's going to the gym and you want to move the maximum amount of weight possible. To move the maximum amount of weight possible, you want to make it as easy as you can on your muscles. Okay. And I know that doesn't sound intuitive initially, but when you compare it to bodybuilding, for example, with bodybuilding, what you're trying to achieve, and by bodybuilding, I use this term very loosely, not just competitive bodybuilding, but anyone who's trying to just build muscle or sculpt their physique, so to speak. Those individuals are trying to get the most stimulus on their muscles, the most amount of muscle work done with the minimal amount of weight. Because if you can use less weight to get a given unit of internal stimulus, then you potentially get less fatigue from that. And you obviously have to load up less plates and all that. So that's actually a beneficial thing. So you're focused on the internal as opposed to the external. And that could be reflected in things like using a technique that's maybe more challenging on a particular muscle. So for example, you might flare your elbows out more on a bench press exercise to emphasize the chest a bit more, whereas you might even be stronger with the elbows tucked. That might be something that you do. There's many different examples of the technical modifications one could make, but all of them come back to trying to actually put more on the muscle as opposed to less, which is what you'd be doing in the performance domain. So that's the first thing that you have to understand. So other than your technique, then you've got things like tempo, for example, where you're slowing down the rep. Obviously, that's not necessarily the best way to move the maximum amount of weight, but it does increase the stimulus to some degree. And then there's also things like intent or internal focus, where if you're doing a bench press, for example, if you slide your hands in together or have the intent of sliding your hands in together, you're going to feel your chest absolutely light up, and you're adding another kind of force vector to the exercise so that it becomes more challenging, but that means that you're able to lift more weight as a result. So if you were doing a 1 rep max with that technique, that'd be pretty inefficient, but inefficiency is the goal when you're trying to build muscle. Obviously, one of the things you might be thinking is that, oh, well, you guys, what about Olympic weightlifters and powerlifters and all these people who build loads of muscle? Like if they're chasing efficiency, how does that work? So we're not saying that you won't build plenty of muscle if you're trying to be as efficient as possible. You absolutely can. It's just not necessarily the primary goal. If you're a purist in terms of just focusing on your physique or bodybuilding, trying to be inefficient to some degree by placing the maximum amount of tension on the desired muscles is generally a good idea. The way you can extrapolate this out to a more extreme example would be something like a leg extension or any isolation exercise. The most efficient way to get the weight to the top of the rep on a leg extension is just to swing from the bottom. Use all your body, raise your hips up, lean back, and just swing to the top. You'll notice then that the weight moves very easily. But if you pull yourself down, you keep the hips locked, you sit a bit more upright, and you slowly raise to the top and pause, it's very inefficient for the amount of weight that you can move, but the stimulus on your quads is totally different. So that's an extreme example, and the differences are going to be a little bit more subtle on most exercises, whether it be a squat or a bench press, etc. But on the isolation exercises, you can definitely start to appreciate it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think especially when people use oh, well, what about Olympic weightlifters, or what about powerlifters, or what about blah, blah, blah. It is obviously a really good discussion because it does help to illuminate what we're talking about here, because everyone knows that if you bounce the bench press, like if you bounce the bar off your chest in a bench press, you're going to lift more weight, right? Like that's you doing less work. That's you literally using that elastic energy. Boom, you're getting up, 4, 5, 6 inches off the chest from just basically absorbing that kinetic energy and bouncing it back, right? Like your chest cavity is doing the work rather than your muscles, right? And that is obviously why in actual competitive powerlifting, they're like, no, we actually have to pause for a second on the chest, right? They're trying to minimize to that extent, to a huge extent, the amount of, recoil you can basically use, that amount of momentum that you can use to just, go through the movement. But everyone knows that if we really were trying to maximize efficiency, maximize the amount of weight lifted, you are realistically going to bounce that bar off your chest, right? But that's, in a way, minimizing the amount of work that your chest is actually doing, right? And this is where this dichotomy is, because if we're like a bodybuilder or someone that's interested in, transforming their physique, like you want to build this like armor plated chest, you are going to slow down that movement. You're going to control that change of direction. You're going to try like modify your technique in, different ways. Like you said, maybe you're flaring the elbows a little bit more. Maybe you are using a little bit more intent, like you're actively thinking of like, pushing the hands in on the bar, or maybe pushing the elbows in as you raise the bar. You're going to do these different things, these different like internal cues, so that you are actually maximizing the amount of tension on the chest, whereas with something like powerlifting, or especially with something like Olympic lifting, you are trying to minimize the amount of work your muscles actually have to do. You're trying to maximize the amount of like momentum we can use, the amount of stored energy we can use. And this is why, especially with Olympic lifting, it's so technical, it's so technique driven. Like you have to be so precise with your timing. You're trying to catch that momentum perfectly, and what you don't want to have happen is you catch it imperfectly and then your muscles have to do some work. Like if you see someone do that, you're like, oh, it doesn't look clean, or oh, like you can see they struggled with it, right? So this is something that we have to get clear in our mind. Like, what is the perfect rep, right? The perfect rep is the rep that elicits the adaptations that we want, right? And how do we design that perfect rep? Well, again, it comes back to, first of all, knowing what goals you're actually aiming towards. Like, are we trying to maximize strength, and strength maybe just, weight on the bar, like in a competitive sense, like powerlifting or something, but strength might also be, oh, we want to actually be strong while keeping tension on the muscle, like you might have to do a sport or an activity that requires you to be quite slow and deliberate in your movements. Say, for example, like you might be doing chin-ups to improve your Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Like maybe you're always getting choked out in a rear naked choke situation. And you're like, right, I just keep getting caught in it. I need to work on my technique. But in the meantime, I'm going to try get this kind of like chin up position, this elbow down position, stronger, so that I buy myself a few extra seconds, right? So I can, wiggle out of it, do something else, right? So in that case, you're like, okay, well, I could just boom, bang through these chin up reps and like have very little tension on the muscle, not control that top position whatsoever. It's basically just momentum getting you through it. That's probably not going to translate as much into improvements in the goal that you have for that exercise than something like, oh, a slower, controlled, really thoughtful movement where you're actually, contracting the muscles, actually, slowly going through the movement. So you have to be very clear on what you're actually trying to achieve, right? And the beauty of all of this is that, and it's also a little bit of a bad thing about it, is that you can get results without ever having to think about this stuff, right? And that's great in a way that it's like, okay, that means that you don't have to necessarily, spend an overly, energetic amount of time thinking about this stuff and going like, oh, well, how do I maximize the exact adaptations that I'm trying to build? Because like you said, like you can see powerlifters that are, jacked out of their mind, it's like, okay, well, clearly, powerlifting builds muscle, right? And that is true, but it's basically an inefficiency that does that, and obviously, like, again, weight classes, and some people do want to actually look a certain way, etc., right? But that is good in that aspect, that it's like you can basically get results as a byproduct of, just going through the motions even. But that only works up until a point, right? And obviously, like, that's fine if you are just this like perfectly built human for these exercises, like, you're built for the squat, and like you squat and it's just perfect tension throughout, it works all the muscles that you want to work. It's not like a low back exercise. That's fine. You can basically just have at it, bang away through that exercise, see you later. You're going to get results, right? But if you are not, built for these different exercises that you're trying to do, you're going to have to think a bit more about, first of all, your exercise selection. That would be the best thing to do. But then also think a bit more about like, how do I manipulate this rep to actually get the adaptations that I want, right? And this is, again, especially true if we're trying to really maximize, we'll call it physique change, muscle building, because while you can just build muscle as a byproduct of, resistance training, just even going through the motions, if we're trying to build the most amount of muscle possible, we're going to have to be a bit more precise with our actions, right? So do you have anything to say there, Gary?
Yeah, just one thing to add on there, and it's related to the what you were just talking about there at the end. So if we're talking about, let's say, the powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting example again, you can turn around and say, oh, well, once you just take the muscle to failure or close to that point, why does it even matter? Because we equal out the work on the muscle, because let's say you do 8 slow reps versus 12 or 15 bouncy reps. Like, what's the difference? The muscles are still being taken towards failure. But what you have to realize is that for every rep that you're completing and every load that you're lifting, there's forces also being distributed to muscles that aren't necessarily the target muscles, but also the joints across which those muscles are acting. And that really tends to be the differentiating factor that's important here, where if you're doing powerlifting to build muscle, powerlifting tends to carry a higher injury risk than bodybuilding. Bodybuilding, out of the strength sports, at least from the research that's there, and to be honest, like, I wouldn't put too much faith in it, but the bodybuilding has the lowest injury rate of all strength sports. And it's very intuitive why that would be the case, because, well, one, there's no exercise you have to do. So if you hurt yourself, you can just change exercises and find something that feels better. But also, again, bodybuilders are focused on that internal focus. So they can get the same stimulus with lighter weights or by changing intent or changing range of motion, etc. Whereas if you're a powerlifter, you're trying to maximize the weight all the time. And that comes with additional forces on the joints, additional risk of, if you do lose your position, the absolute load is greater, and therefore there's more potential for accidents. So they're the things that are really important, because especially over the long term, the bottleneck for people in terms of making progress is very often injury, and not necessarily catastrophic injury, but just niggly injuries that flare up. Because if you need to get to, let's say, 20, 25 sets per week because you're advanced to train your quads or your chest or whatever, and when you get to 15 to 20, you're no longer able to tolerate more because your just shoulder starts to get at you or your knee starts to get at you, then you're left in this position of kind of perpetual maintenance where, yeah, you might make some progress, but you're no longer able to apply the stimulus that you need to in order to keep going. So remember that difference in your own head when you're thinking about the difference here, because it's very easy to just reduce it all down to, oh, well, it's all just, taking the muscle close to failure so I can do what I want. But long term, that doesn't necessarily work out that way.
Yeah, and further to that as well, like, we have to go back to the discussion we had previously about like exercise selection and execution, and we touched on it in the last episode. But if you're choosing these exercises, like you're doing powerlifting, you're like, oh, it's the squat, the bench, the deadlift, like, we're just assuming that, the prime movers, if you will, are the muscles that are going to be taken to failure. But as we discussed in the last episode, like, you could be doing a squat for quad development, and the only thing that actually ever fails is your low back. That's the thing that fatigues. It's never actually your quads. So you are not actually getting the amount of stimulus that your quads potentially need before your low back gives out or something, So we have to think about that in terms of what are our actual goals. And again, the ideal discussion here is a discussion of exercise execution and selection. It's like, if we can get those, you're like, oh, you're doing a squat for quad development, and this is just not a quad exercise for you. It's like, we ideally would be choosing a better exercise. But again, if we have to do the squat for whatever reason, like it's, you're a power lifter and you're trying to build muscle with that exercise, if you do need to build your quads, potentially we're doing a different exercise. We're modifying the reps, perhaps. We're actually making it so that this exercise is performed a little bit slower. Maybe we've slightly changed the bar position. Maybe you were in a lower bar position, now you're in a high bar position when we're using this exercise for more quad development. And then also you're controlling the tempo so that you actually can stay in that upright position. You're not ever getting out of that position. You're not like, slightly tipping forward in that squat, even though you're trying to use your quads, and now all of a sudden it's a low back exercise, a glute exercise, etc. Right? So we are modifying potentially the exercise, but also we can modify the way we perform that exercise so that we can bias tension wherever we want it, right? Because like you said, like you could literally say, oh, well, as long as we, kind of equate for failure in terms of, oh, you did 8 sets of this and you did 8 sets of this. It's like, oh, well, it's all the same at the end of the day. And it's like, that's not true, because we're not actually getting the same stimulus on the muscle itself, right? And again, that goes back to the thing that I opened this podcast with and saying that it's tension that we're looking for, especially for muscle building, right? So if it's muscle building, we want tension on the actual target muscle. So it needs to be on the target muscle. It's not just equating volume on paper, it's equating volume internally. It's what's actually on your muscles. Like if I did a squat and Gary did a squat, they're two different things. Even if we say, oh, it's a high bar squat, like for me, the only thing that's ever going to grow from that is my ass, whereas for Gary, like I could literally do like so much volume for squats, my low back perfectly fine, even though it is a bit more of a low back exercise for me. I could literally do 20 sets, and I've done 20 sets of squats per week. Whereas for Gary, he might do the same, and all of a sudden his adductors, literally he's 5 sets in per week, and his adductors are like, oh, this is terrible, which indicates two things. First of all, the adductors for him are going to be a limiting factor. So that could be, injury, like we talked about. That could be, little niggly stuff, whatever. He's not going to be able to complete the overall volume. But in doing those 5 sets, perhaps it's a much better quad stimulus for him than for me, So those 5 sets might be equal to my 20 sets in terms of the actual amount of tension that was put on the quads. Because for me, again, like I'm tall, long femurs, like it's just not a quad exercise for me. So we have to think of all those things, and it's incredibly hard if you are, a beginner or trying to design your own workout programs, because you just think of exercise in terms of like choreography, in terms of, oh, this is how a squat should look. You're not necessarily thinking of like the previous discussion we had about exercise selection, exercise execution, and you potentially don't know enough to be able to modify those exercises to make them better for your overall goal. Does that make sense, Gary?
Check. Yeah, it absolutely does. We can, I think we've added enough on that specific point, so we can move on.
I think that's all good, right?